Today we're back on the topic of slavery in the Bible. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, why are we back on that? Well, the reason is because there's a new angle to this that really should settle the matter on the issue of the difference between the treatment of foreign slaves and Hebrew slaves. I've never heard this argued before. Doesn't mean it hasn't been, but it's just been revealed to me, and I'm going to show you what it is. I hope you've got your paper or your notebook and you're ready to take notes. The nuance between the treatment of Hebrew versus foreign slaves in the Old Testament. The foreign slave released in the land would become an economic competitor with the sons of the inheritance of Abraham. This difference in treatment then upholds that promise by saying that foreign slaves, if you have a foreign slave, he's a slave for life, versus the Hebrew slave who's released after 6 years. That honors the covenant that God made with Abraham and protects the land for the sons of Jacob, aka Israel. Now, there are those of you who do not believe in God, who hate God, and by that do not believe the Bible and hate the Bible, and you find every reason to attack it and God. Well, that's something you've got to deal with, okay? That's nothing that anyone can do for you. That's your heart. The heart, oriented one way or the other, is what causes your reason to rationalize one way or the other. Either way, it's faith. Either way. I know that you think that, well, I'm rational and blah, 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 right? Christians aren't, and I'm rational, and they go by faith, which is something imaginary and it is pure trust, but I reason all of my things out. No, you don't. You don't. That's what Blaise Pascal's wager was all about. He was showing to his intellectual colleagues that they do not live by reason and by rationalizing, starting with rationalizing. He proved to them that they operate based on their heart, because based on rationalizing, they would believe in God. They would go to church. Because based on pure rational argument, you have a better chance of success in the end if you believe in God than if you don't believe in God. That was his argument. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's his argument. He wasn't trying to convince people to believe in God through rationalization. He's trying to reveal to them that they're not living the way that they think they're living, based on rationalization and that the heart follows, but that it's the other way around. They're choosing not to go to church, not to believe in God, because their heart doesn't want to. Not because it's reasoned. That was his point. So your heart hates God. Just confess it. Just say it out loud. Just say you hate God. Rather than trying to pretend like you were living a rational life, like you start with reason. You don't even have reason without there being a God. There's no such thing as reason without God. The rational mind doesn't exist apart from there being a God. Let's get back into this, though, about the slavery and the economics. This opens up a new theological and covenantal angle. The distinction, I'm reading from my notes, okay, because this is a new concept, which is supported by Scripture. The distinction between Hebrew and foreign slaves reflects God's covenantal promises, not ethnic superiority or moral failure. Now you can argue, oh, it is absolutely ethnic superiority. No, it's not. Because God constantly criticizes the Hebrews. In fact, when he takes them into the desert, all of them die, except for that last generation, the youngest. God allows all of them to die in the desert and not see the promised land. So there is no sort of ethnic favoritism going on here. Otherwise, he wouldn't let any of them die before they get to the promised land. So, and it's proving they're not ethnically superior, because all of them die for grumbling against God and against Moses' leadership. Having little problems with electricity here and trying to keep the lights going, but I think I've got it solved. So there is no ethnic superiority being demonstrated by these laws, because when you take into consideration the context of the entire story of the Hebrews in the desert with Moses, there's no indication that God thinks that the Hebrews are ethnically superior. So this distinction also is not moral failure on the part of God. It's upholding the covenant that he promised to Abraham, and he's baking it into the judicial treatment of the situations. The Hebrews were heirs of the land by covenant. And you can see that in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. Go read it yourself. You can read it in almost any translation, and you'll see at least that. Even if some of the details are not correct according to the Septuagint, still, you can see that the Hebrews were heirs of the land by divine covenant. Genesis 12, 15, and 17. The land was their inheritance, tied to God's promise to Abraham. Foreigners, though treated with justice and mercy, were not heirs to that promise. They were not. If foreign bondservants were released with the same land privileges as the Hebrews, they would become economic competitors within a limited tribal inheritance structure. So the land was partitioned among the tribes of Israel. I won't get into the details of that because there are a couple of quirks in that. But it was divided among the tribes of Israel. And so if you're releasing a lot of foreign slaves as independent economic units, households, for example, then they're going to be competing with the sons of Abraham. So, Leviticus 25:46. Let's have a look at that a minute. It says, "And ye shall distribute them to your children after you, and they shall be to you permanent possessions forever. But of your brethren, the children of Israel, one shall not oppress his brother in labors." So now what's the context? Well, verse 45, it says, "And the sons of the sojourners, foreigners, in your land, that are among you, of these ye shall buy, and of their relations, all that shall be in your lands, let them be to you for possession." And it says in verse 47, "And if a stranger or sojourner with thee wax rich, and thy brother in distress be sold to the stranger or the sojourner that is with thee, or to a proselyte by extraction, after he is sold to him, there shall be redemption for him. One of his brethren shall redeem him." And so then it gives these rules for how a Hebrew can buy another Hebrew slave out of slavery from a foreigner who happens to have gotten rich among them. So this context absolutely puts it in the economic competitive frame that the Lord has just revealed to me today on this issue. This is a very important discovery. I haven't heard it discussed at all on this issue of slavery, but it's extremely important, and especially as important as the issue of covenant between Abraham and God for the inheritance of the land is probably the single most important theological issue in the Old Testament. Because out of that comes the Messiah, Jesus. So, let's go on here. So this Leviticus 25:46 reinforces the idea that foreign servants could remain in the household without disrupting the covenantal inheritance structure. But as I pointed out, the context of it, look at in verse 45 and 47, squarely places it in economics, in competition, and also keeping it in that covenant framework of they are brothers. Those two Hebrews, even if they're not related directly, they are brothers, and you are to buy that Hebrew slave out of slavery if he's a slave of a sojourner. Especially, in particular, a rich sojourner, someone who has gotten rich, it says, who has waxed rich. That means accumulated wealth in the land. He's been successful there. He's been an economic competitor. You've got to buy any Hebrew slave that he has. And actually it gives some rules of who should purchase him out of slavery. Now let's look at Leviticus 25:23. We'll go back a little bit in this chapter. Now this is not just about slavery, the 6 years. This is also about property, about houses. And if thy brother, this is verse 25. Why am I not far enough back? It says, in the land, this is verse 23. Yeah. It says, and the land shall not be sold for a permanence, for the land is mine, because ye are strangers and sojourners before me. And in every land of your possession ye shall allow ransoms for the land. And if your brothers... Now notice, God is calling the Hebrews sojourners, foreigners, strangers. For the land is mine because you are strangers and sojourners before me. And in every land of your possession ye shall allow ransoms for the land. And if thy brother who is with thee be poor, and should have sold part of his possession, and his kinsman who is nigh to him come, then he shall redeem the possession which his brother has sold. And if one have no near kinsman, and he prosper with his hand, and he find sufficient money, even his ransom, then shall he calculate the years of his sale, and he shall give what is due to the man to whom he sold it, and he shall return to his possession. But if his hand have not prospered sufficiently, so as that he should restore the money to him, then he that bought the possession shall have them till the 6th year of the release, and it shall go out in the release, and the owner shall return to his possession. And if anyone should sell an inherited house in a walled city, and it goes on and on and on, and it gives all these details, these legal details about how to deal with very specific situations. In all of this, he's not telling them to be this way or to do this thing. But he's saying that in the legal framework, that if this is the situation and if you are this way, then this is what is possible. And when. He's not telling them to be poor. He's not telling them to sell their house or to sell their land, any more than he's telling them to take someone into slavery. When they take a foreigner into slavery, they're bringing that foreigner into the land if he's not in the land. Because there are some conditions for buying slaves among foreigners in other lands. And when they bring them into the land, that's risky. You can't have them become an economic competitor to the sons of the promise of the inheritance of the land. It's very important. God is ensuring that the land stays within the covenantal lines, not commodified or scattered. So if you say, well, that's unfair, Hebrews go free, but foreigners don't, then you don't understand Genesis. You really don't understand Genesis. You haven't really taken to heart seriously in the historical context of what the time was like and what God was doing with Abraham in preparation for the Messiah when Jesus came. You don't understand that. Or maybe you just flat out reject it. If that's the case, then you have no voice to speak about the Bible, or slavery in the Bible, or any other topic in the Bible. You need to shut your mouth. And I'm speaking to Cygnus Ustus, the one who's commented under the first video. Very ignorantly, inflammatory, ignoring everything that I'm laying out, and just pushing his emotions, and then trying to demean me. It's very sick. But this video that I'm making right now adds yet another reason that men like Cygnus Ustus are perverse fools. They do not love wisdom. They don't want to think hard and deep. They want to react. And they think everything they think, and they think everything that they think is correct. But they don't want to plumb the depths and do the hard thinking. They want to just react. Now, I'm sorry for the issues with the sound. When I dealt with the lights here, I forgot to put the microphone back on. But I'll try to deal with that in production. So I'll try to make the volume so it's up high enough and the echo isn't so bad. Okay, we'll see how it goes. So this distinction between foreign slaves and Hebrew slaves is rooted in the Abrahamic covenant, as I pointed out, not in racial hierarchy. It happens to look to us of today like a racial issue. But that's because, number one, especially Americans, more than anyone in the world, we see race in everything. I mean, racism, discrimination based on racism, in everything. We're programmed to do that. We're brainwashed to do that. And until you've lived abroad for over 7 years or more, you have no idea what I'm talking about. You really don't. Because you are immersed in it from every corner. Now, this looks like a racial issue. Well, because we're dealing with a race of people who've been given a land, an ethnic group. Yeah, they're all related. Well, there's some dispute about that coming out of Egypt, right? But after Egypt, they're all intermingling now, right? So God was protecting the promised inheritance, keeping the land and its economic structures within the covenant family. It's the same reason land returned to tribes during Jubilee. Just like I said, to uphold the promise of Abraham. To uphold the promise to Abraham. Foreigners were treated justly, but they were not covenant heirs. You can only call that unjust if you deny the legitimacy of God's covenant altogether. And if you don't believe in God, then you don't believe that God made a covenant with Abraham. And the whole thing falls apart for you. So if you don't believe in God, then why are you trying to discuss this issue about the Bible? You're using a judgment of the Bible without taking it seriously and in context of what it's claiming. You're claiming there's no God, therefore there's no covenant, therefore there is no reason except racial discrimination here. That's not what they believed. Whether you believe there's a God or not, you cannot dismiss the fact that Abraham believed there was a God and that he believed he had a covenant with God, and that the sons of Jacob, aka Israel, believed that they had a covenant with God for that land. Now you may come up with all these different conspiracy theories, like, oh, they invented that after Egypt. They saw the land, they said they wanted it, and they came up with this story, this backstory. You may say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never existed. Joseph didn't exist. All those people didn't exist. It was a backstory that was created in order to justify going in and taking the land. I've heard such things. You don't have a shred of evidence for that. And yet you believe that. That means you're a nutcase. That means you're a tinfoil hat person, really, thoroughly. You're invented a conspiracy where there's no conspiracy. And you're dismissing historic record that dates back thousands of years. Just because you hate God. Like I said, your heart is oriented against God, you hate God, and therefore you try to justify that with your rationalizations, conspiracy theories. There was no covenant. It was all fabricated. It's racial motives, projecting your moral imperialism onto every age of history. So let's ask a couple of telling questions here. Do you think the promises of God to a people group should be broken in the name of abstract modern equality? Now, I've talked about that in the first video. Is honoring divine covenant less moral than redistributing everything equally among all people who happen to come along? Divine covenants carry real world implications. And we have to realize that. Whether you're a recipient of that divine covenant or not, whether you believe that God made that covenant with them or not, when you look at them, you must take them on their own standard, not on yours. Not on yours. Your humanist, post-enlightenment idolatry of the self, of the individual. Like you have a right to have choices. You think that every person has a right to have choices? And of course you're going to say, of course we do. It's immoral to say that they don't. And yet we have examples in our own time, in our own civilization, in our own societies, where we absolutely, based on moral values, deprive some of their rights, of their choices. I've mentioned that before, and you've tried to play word games with it. Incarceration. That's a form of slavery today. It's undoubtedly a form of slavery. Incarceration, prison. We deprive some of their freedom because they have committed crimes. And the worse the crime, the longer the time we deprive them of that freedom. The longer they have to be a slave to the state. Now some of you, one of you said, oh, but they're not slaves, they're wards of the state. That's a modern phrase that's been used to disguise slavery. Because the civil rights movement, right? You had the Civil War, you had the civil rights movement, and then what are you going to do? You're going to still, point out that prisoners are slaves. They don't have freedom. They can't come and go as they please. Their day is determined based on those who are managing them, their masters. They can even execute them. That's right, they can kill their slaves. Some states, they have laws against that. Some states don't. Some states actually allow for killing a criminal. It has to be judged by the court and decided on and sentenced. But it is a possibility. And it's legal and it's considered moral. In some cases, they argue that it's more moral to execute some certain criminals than to let them live. Some others argue that why are we paying for their rent, their food, their clothes to keep them alive when they're unwilling to obey the law and stop putting citizens in harm? So some are arguing that we should kill them anyway. Not release them, certainly not. Kill them, rather than pay in order to keep them alive when they're unwilling to reform their ways and be a normal citizen and not kill other citizens. So this is a hotbed right there. So if you dismiss this issue of the covenant between God and Abraham, then you're no longer arguing about slavery. You're arguing about whether God had a right to choose Israel. Or you're arguing about the existence of God. But it's not about slavery then. You're just using slavery as a straw man. That's all. As an excuse. And that's what really is happening. You're using slavery as an excuse to try to argue against people over the existence of God. Claiming, well, if there is a God who wrote the Bible and it supports slavery of any sort, well, that's immoral. Therefore, God would be immoral. Therefore, he's not God. So you're really simply not arguing about slavery. You're arguing about God and whether he exists or not. This discovery, it connects slavery laws to covenant theology. This opens up a whole new horizon for discussing this issue. But it has to be discussed in context. You can't take it out of its social context and put it into a modern context, like America post-Civil War, or post-Civil War and post-civil rights. You can't. So most of the defenses of biblical slavery fall into two camps. Legal historical, it was better than surrounding nations, or ethical apologetic, it wasn't really slavery as we understand it today. And both of those are correct. But this angle firmly roots it in the narrative of Genesis and Abraham and Israel and the Messiah to come. The unequal treatment exists not because of ethnic supremacy or lack of mercy, but to preserve the inheritance of Abraham's covenant family. That's why. And everywhere you turn and you read, that's what it's about. So critics like Cygnus Ustus love to say, why do Hebrew slaves get released and foreign ones don't? Sounds racist. most responses try to argue for equal treatment by minimizing differences. But I'm not doing that. I explain the differences and that it makes sense in the context of the narrative of Genesis. God is protecting the economic integrity of the inheritance he promised to Abraham's descendants. That requires different handling of insiders and outsiders without cruelty or injustice. That puts critics in a bind. Either reject God's right to form a covenant people, or accept that not all laws are about egalitarianism. That's a modern concept. So I'm tapping into a larger biblical framework that builds on biblical land theology. Land equals promise plus identity plus provision. And a lot of the laws about the land and how they are to cultivate the land and give it rest and a Sabbath for the land play into the provision part of this formula. Land equals promise plus identity plus provision. Foreigners could live in the land and be treated well, but they were not heirs. Just like Gentiles weren't circumcised under the Mosaic law unless they entered covenant. They weren't included in land inheritance structures. By keeping foreign servants within households instead of freeing them into independent economic units, the land economy stayed intact. This makes Leviticus 25 more coherent than if we read as brute inequality. So think of it like an ancient agrarian society where land is limited and permanently tied to family bloodlines, which is exactly what Israel was. If you suddenly enfranchise every foreigner into land ownership, you collapse that structure. What God gave as inheritance to the tribes would be diluted and disrupted, and the inheritance would disappear. I hope this has really gotten you to see it in a completely different light. May the Lord bless you as you seek Him with all your heart.